today's gospel, we see Peter rebuking Jesus. Jesus, after having given the keys to the kingdom of heaven to Peter, predicts to him the passion that he is about to suffer in Jerusalem, saying that he'll be handed over and he will be killed, and on the third day he will rise again. And then Peter comes and he rebukes Jesus, saying this cannot happen. And then Jesus, in turn, tells him, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're thinking as man does, not as God does." Now, Peter and the disciples have at this point given up almost everything they've had for Jesus. Jesus has told them that he who's not willing to give up house or property or husband or wife or mother or father or son or daughter for the kingdom of heaven is not worthy of him. And the apostles asked that they have given up everything for Jesus, is their reward in heaven. Now here Jesus gives that command he does before, where explaining what he's saying to the apostles, that he who does not pick up his cross and follow him is not worthy of him. So we're always called to enter into this discipleship of Jesus Christ, to try and live like he lives. But at this point, Peter rebukes him. And in a way, what do we see in ourselves here? How do we see that we have this desire to follow Jesus as long as it doesn't become too uncomfortable, as long as we're not asked to sacrifice too much? Does Peter rebuke Jesus not because of the fact he's being asked to give certain things up, but because of the fact that Peter knows if Jesus is crucified, if he's killed, Peter is expected to follow? Well, we know from what happens in the Passion narrative that Peter doesn't do this. None of the apostles do this. In fact, out of all the apostles, only one eventually returns to Jesus before his crucifixion is over, while he's still on the cross, and that's John. Now, it isn't just the New Testament here that speaks to what Jesus is teaching, but this whole idea is already set up in the Old Testament. Even in the reading in particular that we have for the Old Testament today, in the book of Jeremiah, it says, "You have seduced me, O Lord, and I let myself be seduced. You're too strong for me, and you prevailed." We're supposed to have this kind of total giving over of ourselves to Jesus, to Christ in our lives. This particular verse always reminds me, and if you haven't seen, I would highly recommend it, this movie called In the Great Silence. It's this documentary of sorts going into the life of the Carthusian monasteries, which is kind of like it's a monastery that is a group of hermits. They live completely separate within this monastery, and they only come together for prayer. And they spend their whole day in silence except for prayer. The only time they have to congregate is for one meal on Sunday, where they have a meal together, they get a chance to talk, and they get to have their exercise, where they get to travel, stuff like that. So these are people who have really just given themselves over to Christ, just everything they are to Jesus Christ. Now ourselves, we have the same issue we struggle with all the time. As our society becomes more sophisticated, according to St. John Henry Newman, he says our excuses for sin become equally sophisticated. So we can look at ourselves when we ask, how am I ready to follow Christ? Have I given up family to the extent I'm supposed to? But also, have I given up my wealth? Have I given up everything that I have I use to identify myself? No. Or do I succumb to this temptation of saying I need to accumulate certain things because it's just simply proven to do so? We accumulate perhaps wealth far beyond what we need for our condition, and we call it prudence. We call it safe judgment. We use this as an excuse to try and live a certain level with a certain level of comfort in our lives. How much of what we have do we need? And how much of it is getting in our way of following Christ, of picking for a cross? Because how much time do we spend suffering outside of those times that the Catholic Church tells us we have to? And they tell us you need to fast on these days. And they tell us you can't eat meat in these days. How often do we actually engage in carrying our cross to Christ and foregoing those things that we see as being what we deserve as the fruit of our labor? Because we're always called into a greater relationship with Christ, to follow him, to forsake or forego the pleasures that we would be entitled to, perhaps, even legitimately, but to forego them anyway, to follow Christ and to go into relationship with him.